It was on this very day, Wednesday, Nisan 14 on the Jewish calendar, and the 14th day of the first month, the month of the Aviv barley on the Creator's calendar, the day of the annual Passover sacrifice in Jerusalem, Israel. Yeshua of Nazareth, the only begotten Son of the one true God, was hanging on a Roman cross outside Damascus Gate, at the foot of the highest peak of Mount Moriah, Golgotha, the place of the skull. His crime? Keeping the commandments of God delivered to us by Moses at Mount Sinai, while vehemently and repeatedly violating the man-made commandments of the dominant religious system in the land of Israel. The miracles Yeshua performed in the presence of multitudes proved that his authority to violate and break the back of the religious system came directly from the throne room in heaven. Nearly every miracle he performed directly desecrated established Pharisee law, of which most of the religious world today is completely ignorant. The multitudes that followed Yeshua recognized and heralded him as the prophet of whom Moses prophesied, the prophet who will only speak and act on what he hears directly from the throne of God. The prophet we are required to shema, to hear and obey or face judgment. Yeshua did not proclaim himself, nor did he allow anyone to reveal that he was the Messiah. Yeshua's primary mission as the prophet was to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah, to deliver the oppressed, heal the broken in body and spirit, and to declare the year of God's acceptance and provision for his people. If he succeeds in his first mission, then he will return to fulfill his role as a son of David, who will rule the earth with a rod of iron and put to the sword the evil politicians, the diabolical financial sorcerers, and the religious charlatans who manipulate, intimidate, and destroy people for their own power, wealth, and glory. The people did not understand, and if Satan would have known that Yeshua's covert mission was to pay the death penalty for Israel's breaking of the blood covenant at Mount Sinai, and Adam's death sentence that was consequently passed on to the entire human race, if the adversary had only known, he would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Hasatan would not have shed the innocent blood. On this day that the Passover was sacrificed, we look back on the previous day's events to understand that Passover was indeed a prophetic shadow picture of good things to come when we were delivered from Egyptian bondage. And now we understand that the prophet, King David, composing the songs of the temple liturgy, saw beforehand the coming of the Messiah and wrote the Psalms as a symphony to accompany the greatest story never told. That story I will tell at our live Passover memorial celebration this coming Saturday evening after sunset, at the time of the first fruits harvest. But sundown tonight begins the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when we remember and tell the story of our deliverance from Egypt, the true story that we continue to tell so the entire world will know that Yahowah is the one true God. It is the story of the nation, the mixed multitude that followed Moses out of Egypt and were baptized in the Red Sea and brought to the mountain of God, where he made an everlasting covenant and gave us instructions on how to conduct ourselves as a nation of his priests and kings. Before we shut down our phones, disconnect the internet, and enter our chambers to read and retell the story, I will rehearse with you the events of the preceding 24 hours, the hours preceding the Passover sacrifice. It was 5 days ago, on the previous Friday, Nisan 9, Yeshua and several of his disciples prepared for Shabbat dinner and spent the night in the home of Shimon in Bethany. Shimon, a healed leper, with their mutual friend Lazar and his sisters Miriam and Martha. Without fully understanding what she was accomplishing by her expensive offering, Miriam anointed Yeshua's feet with perfume for his upcoming burial. Judas, the thief among the apostles, remonstrated at the waist. The next morning, the Sabbath, Nisan 10, Yeshua entered into Jerusalem during the Passover lamb procession, riding on an ass that had never done a day's work in its life. Yeshua taught on the Temple Mount, addressed the Gentiles who had come up to the feast, and returned to Bethany for the night. The next day, Sunday, Nisan 11, Yeshua cursed a fig tree on the way into Jerusalem, and then caused a major uproar on the Temple Mount with the merchants who were given permission by the Sanhedrin to violate the sanctity of the temple for their personal monetary gain. The next day, Monday, Nisan 12, the apostles were amazed that the fig tree had dried up from the roots overnight. Yeshua returned to the temple to continue to expose the religious system in front of the multitude and his disciples. He explicitly warned them to obey Moses, but do not obey the takanot, the invented rules of the Pharisees that they have illegally added to the commandments of Moses. Yeshua stormed out of the temple, shouting, "Your house is left to you desolate. You will not see me again until you say, Baruch haba b'shem Yehovah. Blessed is he that comes in the name of Yehovah." Yeshua crossed the brook Kidron and ascended up the Mount of Olives overlooking the temple, and instructed 4 of his apostles concerning the great tribulation preceding his return at the end of the age. They returned to Bethany for the night, and the following day, Tuesday, Nisan 13, the Sanhedrin and priests conspired with Judas to arrest Yeshua in private. That same day, the disciples moved from Bethany into the upper room of a Jerusalem townhouse and began to prepare for the Passover meal the following evening. That evening at supper, now Nisan 14, the evening before the Passover sacrifice, Yeshua told his disciples that he will not eat the Passover with them until it is fulfilled in the kingdom, and that one of them would betray him, setting the stage for his crucifixion. After dinner, Yeshua interpreted the blessing, the breaking of the bread, and the wine that Melchisedec brought to Avram. As Yeshua said, "Abraham saw my day and he rejoiced." Yeshua instructed them to remember him as often as they break bread and drink wine, and this is the Lord's Supper, his last supper in his flesh and blood body. When Abraham brought forth bread and wine, when Melchizedek brought forth bread and wine to Abraham, when he came back from rescuing his nephew Lot and slaughtering the kings, he brought forth bread and wine, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem, Jerusalem, the high priest, he brought forth bread and wine, and he blessed the Most High with a blessing that Abraham then picked up, and he continued on with that, because Abraham saw in that blessing of the bread and the wine an understanding in seeing the coming of the one who would be our Redeemer. And as Melchizedek spoke that blessing, blessing the Most High, Baruch atah Yehovah, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And Yeshua said that night, as he was sitting with his disciples, and he gave that blessing, and then he broke the bread, and he said, "This represents my body, which will now be broken for you. As often as you do this in remembrance of me." Now, we remember this is the 14th day of the month. The sun has just set, and the following day is when the Passover lambs will be sacrificed. This is not the Passover meal, and it is part of the temple liturgy that was done in the first and the second temple period, especially the second temple period that we concentrate on, that the following day they would have 2 loaves of bread, giant loaves of bread that would be set upon the top of the temple enclave, on top of the retaining wall at the place of the trumpeting. And these 2 loaves of bread were put there, and that day, in the afternoon, when one of the loaves of bread was removed, after that, no more leavened bread was eaten. Then when the second loaf was removed, at that point, that loaf was taken down and it was burned. It was incinerated at the altar, and then from then on, all of the leavened bread in the nation, and especially there at Jerusalem, was put into the fire and incinerated. There was to be found no leavened bread in the entire nation. But that was a rehearsal that took place the following afternoon before the Passover lambs were sacrificed. The night of the Last Supper, Yeshua interpreted the blessing of the bread and the wine, that blessing that was spoken by Melchisedec. And Yeshua said, "You remember that I told you, and we never, ever said that blessing that the Pharisees command must be spoken before anyone ever eats any bread. Before one is allowed to eat bread, according to Pharisee law, they must take a 2-handled pot, a negelvesser. They fill it with water, and then they take it with one hand and wash the other, and then back and forth, and they say this blessing that they made up, this takanot, this law which changed biblical law, and they said, 'Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us by your commandments, commanding us concerning the washing of hands.'" There was never any such commandment given by Almighty God. And even the Pharisees admit that God didn't give that commandment. You cannot find that commandment in the scripture. They say, we were the ones who made that commandment. And when you obey us and you wash your hands with this 2-handled pot and you say that blessing, you are acknowledging that we have the authority to add to and subtract from the scriptures. That we have the authority by God to violate what Moses said, that no one is allowed to add to or diminish from, so that we might keep all the commandments of Yahowah our God. So Yeshua never washed his hands with a 2-handled pot. He never spoke that prayer, and none of his disciples did. When they numbered in the thousands in the Galilee, they never did it. And that is what fueled the ire of the Pharisees. And as if to say to Yeshua, you think you can get away with this in the Galilee? Yeah, you come to Jerusalem and you're a dead man. And that was the background to what Yeshua said the night of the Last Supper. He said, no, we do not make up this thing that God commanded us concerning the washing of hands before we eat bread. No, I want you to understand that the blessing that the Melchisedec, the King of righteousness, that blessing that he spoke to the Almighty, Baruch atah Yahowah Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem mi'haaretz, that this blessing and the breaking of this bread is now and has always represented my body, which will now be broken for you. I am the bread brought forth from the earth. I am God's provision. And by his stripes, we are healed. And so that night with his disciples, after the Last Supper that he had with his disciples, then he interpreted that very thing for us that Melchisedec brought to Abraham. And that is how Abraham saw Yeshua's day, and he rejoiced. And he gave a tenth of everything to the King of Righteousness, because he was so moved, so thankful to Almighty God that Yahowah had made a plan. He had made a provision. And Yeshua said, I am that provision. I am the bread that's brought forth from the earth. And then Yeshua took the cup. And he said that very blessing again. He blessed the Most High. Baruch atah Yahowah Eloheinu melech haolam. Barei peri hagafen. Blessed are you, Yahowah, our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. And he said, this represents the renewed covenant in my blood. The covenant that offered to make you priests and kings. The covenant that Israel broke before Moses even returned from the mountain with the tablets of stone. That covenant that they broke, that blood covenant that they broke, and incurred the death penalty, which is the result of breaking the blood covenant, the covenant they made with the Almighty. And he said, this represents the renewed covenant in my blood. I will pay the death penalty for you. And then I will make you my priest and kings. Priest and kings unto Yahowah, my Father. Yeshua then took his cup. He passed it around to his disciples. And he said, you divide it among yourselves. I will not drink of the fruit of the vine till I drink it in that new day in my Father's kingdom, at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so every time we do this in remembrance of him, what he's done for us. By his stripes we were healed. By his blood we were washed. And he has made us priests and kings. So they divided it among themselves. And then when the cup came back to Yeshua, it was empty. And he said, I won't drink any of the fruit of the vine till I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And so every time we do this in remembrance of him. After Yeshua did this, then he took a piece of leavened bread, artos. He dipped it in the sop and he gave it to Judas and sent Judas out of the room. The disciples all thought that he was sent out to buy more provisions for the Passover feast the next night, or to give some money to the poor to help them in their Passover preparations, because he was the one that had the bag and stole that which was in the bag. Yeshua instructed the remaining disciples to go out and buy and sell whatever they had to do, but go out and arm themselves with swords. And so, receiving that instruction, Peter said that they already had 2 swords. Yeshua said, it's enough. It is enough to fulfill the prophecy. He was numbered among the transgressors. Yeshua then led the disciples to the garden of the olive press, Gethsemane, on the side of the Mount of Olives, where he was arrested and then taken to the house of Annas and then to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where he was interrogated and beaten. He was then taken to the hall of hewn stones on the Temple Mount early in the morning, where he was again assaulted during an illegal nighttime trial. He was taken to the Praetorian barracks on the northwest corner of the Temple enclave, where Pilate was awakened by the religious mob demanding the execution of Yeshua. The Pharisees and priests refused to go into the Praetorium because they did not want to be defiled and thereby unable to eat the Passover that evening after sundown, the high Sabbath that begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Pilate had to go all the way out to the pavement in front of the Antonia fortress to hear the charges that they were bringing against Yeshua. During Pilate's inquiry, he discovered that Yeshua was from the Galilee, Herod's jurisdiction, and sent him under armed guard to Herod's palace at Jaffa Gate. Herod, happy to see him at first, then became enraged by Yeshua's silence in response to his questions. He mocked him with a royal robe and returned with Yeshua, the King of the Jews, to the Antonia fortress. There, Yeshua was mocked and abused by the Roman soldiers, scourged at the order of Pilate, and at the very hour the high priest was to have concluded the 4-day inspection of the Passover lamb, Pilate pronounced from his judgment seat, "I find no fault in him." Then Yeshua, with the wood of the sacrifice laid upon his shoulders, silently answered Isaac's question, voiced 1,000 years before, "Where is the lamb?" To which his father Avram responded, "God will provide himself a lamb." Now, at the very hour that the Passover lamb was sacrificed in Egypt and was now being sacrificed on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, Yeshua was hanging on the wood of the sacrifice with a thorny thicket of a crown on his head and a sign over him that read, "Yeshua of Nazareth, King of the Jews." When he knew his hour had finally come, Yeshua cried out the last line of his victory song. "It is finished." Now we can understand the one and only sign of Yeshua's authenticity, the sign of Jonah, the one and only sign that he is not only the prophet, but that he is the Messiah, the son of King David, who will return to rule the earth. That sign, 3 days and 3 nights in the grave, and raised on the 3rd day, the weekly Sabbath, just before sunset and the day of the first fruit harvest. Yeshua was dead and in the grave all Wednesday night, all Thursday night, and all Friday night. He was in the grave all day Thursday, the high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, all Friday while the women prepared burial spices, and all Saturday, the weekly Sabbath, while the women rested according to the commandment. Yeshua was raised from the dead on the weekly Sabbath and first appeared to Miriam early the next morning before sunrise, the first day of the week. This commemoration tonight sets the stage for the remedy of the broken blood covenant at Mount Sinai and the renewing of the covenant that offered to make us a nation of priests and kings. As Yeshua said in the book of the Revelation, he loved us, he cleansed us with his own blood, and he has made us priests and kings to Yahowah, his Father. Shabbat Shalom. Enjoy this time of remembrance together tonight.